Okay, I think I've got everything set up. Today is not going to be a great day for the audio quality because it is 110 degrees outside. So sometimes when I'm doing this, I'll try not to run the AC so that there's not, background noise. That's not happening this time. I'm running the AC, so you're going to be hearing that. I've still got some classical radio playing. Sometimes it's opera, sometimes it's classical. There was just somebody shredding on a harpsichord earlier. I'm sad that stopped. But today I am sifting through more sediment collected from New Mexico. This is Cretaceous aged. It's going to be about 78.5 million years old. And it could, in theory, have small fossils, including shark teeth, fish bones, and so forth. I've been screening this sort of stuff for the past several weeks, and I've yet to find anything in it. Part of what we do in micropaleontology, is what you would call this, is verifying if there is anything within a particular sample. And so even though nothing's coming up, that's still providing data for us, so we know which areas we've sampled are sterile. And I think there's a good chance that the sample that we've taken this time was sterile. We did find lots of really cool fish bones and teeth and stuff in blocks that the sandstone is derived from, but we've yet to find any in the sandstone itself. So that's all good information for us to have. But that doesn't make for super entertaining, video to watch. Now, Microstream, I would not say is the most entertaining thing that I do, because at most you're going to get 1 to 2 cool things happening per hour when I'm streaming for stuff. It's more about just kind of hanging out and, chatting with people who come in on the, coming in on the live stream. So if you're watching this on YouTube, and we're still broadcasting, you can put in a comment on there, and we can chat. I know people also watch these back, and if there's nothing that's happening, I don't want to waste anybody's time. But today I actually have something that I can discuss. So I'm going to keep looking through this sediment, which I think probably still has nothing. But I thought I might chat a little bit about an interview that I just did. I actually did not just do this interview. I interviewed with a journalist for iHeartRadio back in December of last year, and that was just published a few days ago as part of the podcast Very Special Episodes. And it's about my experience on a game show that never went to air because of allegations of fraud, and there have been I'm not the only one who has made allegations against this show, but I am the only one who has ever done so with my name and face attached. I feel that the role of a scientist is to tell the truth, and that informs the way that I have chosen to tell this story. It's a pretty important part of understanding how I got to where I am, and understanding the way that I think about things, and the values that I've come to have as someone who is very skeptical of, the extreme cost of college and the cost of living here in the United States, and the pressure that that puts on young people who want to be scientists, not just paleontologists, but any type of scientist. And so the story that you can hear, and I've put a link to the show episode is in the description. I can drop that in the chat as well right now. Let's go ahead and do that.
Ricardo Chailly conducting the Berlin Radio Symphony Orchestra with an intermezzo from Manon Lescaut by Giacomo Puccini. Join AZPM and celebrate Juneteenth with a free virtual screening of the documentary Juneteenth, Faith and Freedom, Tuesday, June 17th.
1 second. I just realized I didn't post this on Patreon.
Visit azpm.org/Juneteenth. Here's the Hamburg Quartet number 2. Flute, violin.
So why does a scientist need a Patreon? Well, first of all, mind your own business. But secondly, we're human beings, and we have to pay rent. We have to buy food. And the academic system in this country has never really been great about covering our full expenses. Certainly not for the majority of people who actually do scientific work. There are a handful of very well-known, very well-paid individuals, but that's not the majority of people who actually do scientific work. Lab technicians, researchers, postdocs, pretty famously, fairly poorly paid. The expectation in the industry is that you move between universities, you move between jobs fairly frequently. That's allegedly for your own enrichment, but in reality it means that we have a hard time establishing a presence in a community, establishing connections, and it can lead to a lot of really rough situations people find themselves in, a lot of vulnerability when you don't have the ability to organize as part of a workplace. If there are abusive dynamics to your laboratory, if you're not particularly well paid, just lab technician or a postdoc or a PhD student, and continuing to work in a lab is the only way to move your career forward, and it's also your source of income. It also tends to be your social circle. It also tends to be where your housing is through. You can be in a really vulnerable situation. And these are all things that I think are worth covering, but the story that I talk about in this podcast is not even at the stage that you're in college. This is about the vulnerability that young people can face, young people who want to get into science can face, well before ever even reaching college. It was the story about an offer that I received in the 5th grade. This was 2009. An offer I received to make an appearance as a contestant on a game show produced by Burnett Productions, so this big reality TV company that had produced, Survivor and Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader and all these other shows that were really popular and successful, and they wanted another show that they wanted to focus on. I'm going to sigh heavily every time I have to say this. Child geniuses, proteges, prodigies, that's the word I'm looking for. Really smart kids to answer trivia and The opportunity was to win up to $500,000 doing so. And on its face, especially if you're young, that doesn't sound like all that awful of, a scenario. I thought it sounded like a pretty good opportunity. I wasn't so sure about, what going on national TV would potentially do. There's always side effects, to being really young and exposing yourself in that type of way, but the opportunity to make money that could easily put me through college, right? On the upper limit, $500,000 would have been enough, not just to send me to college and put me through college, but also my sibling as well, my older brother. And, put in a nice donation to some local charities. So when the offer came through, this was in, would have been August or September of 2009. When the offer came through, I accepted it. I genuinely had, and this is one of the things I want to talk about to make sure people understand. I think this comes through in the interview that I did, and when I originally broke this story in a, what would you call it, an expose? An interview that I did for the Arizona Republic back in 2021, I tried to make it very clear that this was my choice to go on this show. I did not face pressure from my family to do this. I faced pressure from capitalism, from the fact that it was a year into the recession. I, as a 10-year-old, did not 100% understand what was going on. I didn't know why, the stock market was crashing. But I knew that it was crashing because I came home from school and I would watch NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams. This was back in the day before he caught lying about being shot down in a helicopter or whatever. NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams showing, the stock market failing, talking about massive unemployment and layoffs. And I'm seeing in my neighborhood homes starting to empty out. And I'm hearing about people losing their jobs. And I understand that, 8 years later, when I turn 18, I have to go to college if I want to be a scientist. I knew I wanted to be a paleontologist from before my earliest memory. This is one of the reason you never really hear this question asked of me in interviews. They do ask it every time, but my answer is really boring. What got you into paleontology? The answer is, I don't remember. Like, it's actually been long enough that I straight up do not remember ever making that choice. It's just kind of always been what I understood was the right thing for me to do. This is where I belonged. This is what would make me happy. And that's, both a blessing and a curse, right? I know I'm very lucky that I was never scrambling around to find meaning. I knew pretty early on what would give my life meaning. And of course, what gives your life meaning is up to you, right? That's not determined by other people. You get to make that choice. But I was like, this is what will make me feel like I made a contribution in my time here on Earth. And it's just unfortunate that paleontology is one of the strangest, most non-traditional, and most difficult industries to break into that you can possibly pick. There's a good reason that there's a chance that you may not personally know any paleontologist. A lot of my friends, I am the only one that they know. Or they are a paleontologist, in which case you know hundreds of us, right? Or thousands, in our community. But for a good number of my friends, I'm the only one that they know. And there's a good reason for that. It's because it's very difficult to do this job. It's very difficult to break into this job. Part of the reason that so few manage to actually make it is because of significant institutional barriers. Those barriers can be... I hope I'm not teaching anybody right now. I hope this is all review, stuff that people understand. That things like systemic racism, sexism, classism, queerphobia, all of these things are things that can prevent you from getting jobs, prevent you from getting into schools, put you at all kinds of disadvantages starting off at life, right? And going into my career, I had a very specific set of privileges. There are a few things that I was really lucky to have. And I made a point, because I don't always get to brag, I don't always get the opportunity, I would say, to brag about my mom. And particularly when I'm telling this story, because it directly involves my dad. He was the one who was helping, train, he was helping me study in the lead up to this show. He was printing out, questions and doing research, buying me books, renting out space at, the library for us to study together. So the story involves my dad pretty directly, and he obviously deserves credit. If you know me and you know my father, you know that the two of us, have a very close ties, right? We've been working together for a very long time. He's been directly helping me on my journey to get to where I am since I was very young. And I'm lucky that he has always had the flexibility, right? This is a primary privilege that I had and that I still have, is that my father had the type of job that paid well enough for him to be able to take a week off at a time. So A, vacation time, and B, the money to be able to fund, taking me, for example, on my first dig was up to the middle of nowhere in Wyoming. And that's not something that everybody has, right? A parent who's able to take time off to help them do that kind of thing. And, I went to public schools. We're not talking about somebody who, grew up with a private tutor or anything like that. I grew up with a public school teacher for a mother, and that's like the other really big advantage that I got. And this is something that I made a point of talking about in this interview that didn't end up making it. And again, this is not a critique of, the editors of the show. We talked for at least 2 hours in the studio and exchanged a number of emails ahead of time where I was answering questions. So obviously stuff gets cut. So I'm not blaming anybody for not 100% of the points that I wanted to make, making it into this interview. But I made the point of saying it in the interview, so I'm going to repeat it here, that my mom is a public school teacher, but also someone specifically focused on remedial teaching, or remedial reading. So helping kids read had a big emphasis when she was raising me from a very young age to be literate, to be comfortable reading. And so, she taught me to read pretty early, and by the time I started first grade, I was reading chapter books. I was reading book 1 of the Magic Treehouse right when I started first grade. At, how old are you when you start first grade? 6 years old? Something like that? And that's, you can't overemphasize how big of a deal reading skills are, and being able to learn information and acquire information beyond what you can find in schools. Because I would never have been able to get where I am if I relied on what was taught to me in the public school system. We had one little unit, one little lesson in first grade on dinosaurs, and from then until 7th grade, we never talked about fossils or paleontology ever again. We had a couple of weeks in 7th grade where we talked about geology or earth sciences, a little bit about fossil history, and then after that, pretty much nothing until I got into college, and I was taking a Geos 308 paleontology at the University of Arizona. So like once in elementary school, once in middle school, and then again in college. That's pretty much the extent of my formal training in paleontology. Everything else had to come from my own independent work outside of school. Reading books, now reading scientific papers. and then through my dad, his ability to take time off and put money in the gas tank, buy food and equipment. I will say that paleontology is one of the cheapest sciences out there to perform. We don't actually need all that much to do it, at least not, I'd say 80% of our function of just getting out into the field. It's not cheap, it doesn't cost nothing to do. But compared with other types of sciences like astronomy or chemistry, we don't need a clean lab. We don't need multi-million-dollar equipment to do what we do. Not really. But it still doesn't cost nothing, right? And again, we're talking about a period of time when the unemployment rate was insane. And this has been a consistent thing from then until now, and for many decades. Here in the United States, wages have not kept up with inflation since the 1970s. Because so many people are not members of a union, they're not receiving anywhere close to, anywhere close to the actual value they provide in their labor to companies. They're getting paid back only a small fraction of that, and the majority of the wealth that workers create in this country goes to the bosses and goes to investors. And so they're not able to enrich themselves or enrich their children at nearly the same degree, just based off of your own sweat equity, right? So that's kind of the way that I like framing the beginning of the story. And the story of our little genius is not something that I can tell in only 10 or 20 minutes. It's a really long and complicated story. It requires, at certain points, me stopping and explaining some not esoteric, but definitely some aspects of dinosaur biology, dinosaur classification, and paleontology itself that you don't learn, on the school grounds, right? It's specialized information. Just to be able to understand why the questions that they were asking on the show itself, to move, when it gets to that point in December when we actually tape the episode, and the questions they're asking me were either ones that they went over with me in the pre-trial runs, which is weird, questions that they used my father to give me the answers to ahead of the taping, which is illegal. Others would argue that because the show was never broadcast, no laws were broken. Whatever. I'm not a lawyer. I certainly don't believe it's ethical, and it was extremely inappropriate, to do to me, to put me in a position where I have to decide between answering questions for college money and standing up for, the truth and saying this wasn't right. But I'm getting kind of ahead of myself. The other thing that I want to preface this story with, something that I went over in the interview that didn't end up making it, but is mentioned in pretty lengthy detail in the 2021 article in the Arizona Republic, is specifically what was going on in Hollywood in the lead up to the creation of this show. So in 2007 and 2008, there was a writer's strike in Hollywood. We just had a strike, a SAG-AFTRA strike in Hollywood a year or so ago. So this is something that people kind of have fresh in their minds. But back in those days, it was a different fight entirely. And Hollywood responded by saying, okay, our writers are on strike. We're going to pivot towards creating television that doesn't require writers. What kind of TV doesn't require writers? Reality TV doesn't require writers. And that's because reality TV is kind of a misnomer. Hi there.
Not being sarcastic about the plans.
Okay. Yeah, I saw him. It's getting pretty crispy, but I don't think we can fit those on our porch.
Yeah, we can.
She's got room inside her apartment. I'm just recounting the writer's strike of 2007 to 2008.
Something I definitely know everything about.
Well, it's important contextually, just in understanding that, like, the reason why so much TV starting around that time and definitely till today is, you already know this, it's not reality, right? Nothing you see on TV is real. It's unscripted. There's not someone literally sitting in a writer's room saying, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. It's a producer sitting off to the side saying, oh, this would be hilarious. Let's see if we can get this to happen.
Makes sense. Yeah, the rise of game shows, too.
Yep. So I'm just discussing that. Why?
I like the lime water.
Thank you. Anyway, yeah, so reality TV is kind of a misnomer. Unscripted is what it actually is. But that doesn't mean that it's not unplanned, right? And in the case of a game show, you may not have writers, but you should sure as hell have researchers, right? You should have somebody who's helping you write the questions and helping make sure that your answers that you're asking people to bet money on, essentially, are correct. And unfortunately, in the case of this show, as I go into in these interviews, yeah, they didn't exactly do a great job at that. And, you know, in some areas, I'm sure, trivia is a lot more straightforward. In paleontology, things are pretty open-ended in a lot of respects. There aren't all that many topics where there's only one correct answer. One correct answer that all sources will agree on, right? And also, they end up being, you know, multi-part questions. So the first question that I was asked on stage while taping the show, name the major periods of Earth's history, is a multi-part answer, right? So the one they were looking for goes like this: the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, Paleogene, Neogene, Quaternary. Sounds like a lot, but that's kind of a massively simplified version of the geological periods, because it's not all of them, actually. It's just the major periods of the Phanerozoic eon. The Phanerozoic representing what people thought of as being the full history of life on Earth. Turns out that some of the periods before the Cambrian, what was generally called the Precambrian, turns out those actually had life too, to some degree. So if I wanted to recount all the periods that matter to a paleontologist, I'm generally starting at the Ediacaran, which is the period right before the Cambrian, because there's pretty good evidence of Ediacaran life as well. Dickinsonia, and some other animals. Or maybe they're animals, maybe they aren't. Paleontology gets really complicated when you get back that far. That's well over 500... You're getting over 550 million years old at that point. But at any rate, one of the periods that I mentioned between the Devonian and the Permian is called the Carboniferous in most places of the world, and this part did make it into the interview. It's called the Carboniferous in most parts of the world. Here in the US, though, pretty often you'll see it split into two subperiods. The Pennsylvanian period, that's the younger one, and the Mississippian period, that's the older one. So another equally valid answer that I could have given would have went like this: Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, Paleogene, Neogene, Quaternary. And I don't think that they would have been prepared for that answer, even though it's equally valid. And that's part of what really kind of undermines this being a good idea for a show, is the ambiguity. If you were able to run this really well, and you had a great research team that was like, okay, here's all the valid answers, and we're going to make sure that if he gives a valid answer, you know, he'll know, right? We'll be able to accommodate for that. I don't think that that they were expecting anything other than the exact set of answers that they had programmed in. And I think that, I mean, the evidence bears out that they intended to slip me answers so that I would respond in the exact way that they were prepared for. So the first question I was asked on stage is name all those periods. Second question they ask on stage is, what are the two major subgroups in the clade Dinosauria? Who named them, and in what year did he name them? Now, the two major subclades, Saurischia and Ornithischia, that's pretty basic stuff. That's stuff that I already knew. The name of the person who did that and the year that he did it in is pretty niche knowledge. It's not something that, even as a paleontologist, knowing off the top of your head is really not all that important. It only takes 20 seconds to look up for when you need to reference it, if you even need to go back that far, right? If you're writing a research paper and you need to reference the original split of Ornithischia and Saurischia, maybe you remember Seeley 1888 off the top of your head. You don't need to know his first name, though. And I was 10 years old and not at the stage where I'm writing research papers, so you can kind of see where I'm going with that. But the primary issue with that question is that before the taping of the show, a producer pulled my dad aside and told him, hey, Ben really needs to know that Harry Seeley in 1888 was the one who split Dinosauria into Saurischia and Ornithischia. Do you think he knows that? And my dad said, I don't know. I'll check with him, I guess. And the heavy implication that was given is that that information was important for me to know because it might have something to do with a surprise member of the audience or potentially one of the expert panelists. So one of the aspects that isn't really talked about super well as far as how the show was set up is that there's a panel of experts, 3 PhDs or just people in academia who are responsible for basically advising the parents, who are the ones who are actually in charge of playing the game, advise them as to whether they think their kid can actually accurately answer the question that is being asked. So they're basically the lifeline there. The parents are the ones who decide whether the kid moves on from one round to the next or whether they stop where they are and cash out with the money they've already won. So if you cash out, you get the money. If you go forward and risk, right, you might lose money and get bumped back down to your previous safety net amount. Now, the safety net, the first one, for $10,000, is after the third question. So when we were preparing for the show, all my parents ever told me was, if you can get the first 3 questions right, you're walking away with $10,000, which is a lot of money for a 10-year-old, right? In the end, that would not have covered a significant portion of my college education, unfortunately, because tuition rates in this country, again, are insane. And if you want to blame anybody for a 10-year-old being in this position where they feel pressured to pay for their own college or potentially not be able to live the life in science as they want to live, make the contributions as part of their life that they want to make, we should have tuition-free college, tuition-free public college and universities, right? That's the actual problem here. And secondarily, the problem is that on the set of the show, I did not have, right, somebody who was responsible for checking in with me as the child talent to make sure that I felt comfortable at all times with what was going on. I did not have someone that I could go to if I felt uncomfortable or if I felt that something was wrong. If this was a union set, right, a traditional workplace in Hollywood, where SAG-AFTRA, it was actually not called SAG-AFTRA at the time. I think SAG, the Screen Actors Guild, and the other union converged sometime after this 07-08 strike. So at the time, it wouldn't have been called SAG-AFTRA. I think it would just be SAG. But at any point, having a union worker and union protections in the workplace would have come with all kinds of, from the producer's perspective, red tape, right? Unnecessary cost, things that are slowing down production. But from my perspective, are really essential for making sure that you're doing an ethical production that isn't emotionally damaging, potentially, to the people working on it. And it did end up being pretty emotionally damaging to me to be on this show as a 10-year-old, because they did bad research. They took advantage of the fact that no one, my family are not people who are used to working in Hollywood, so we don't know what is normal or abnormal in these situations. And yeah, using the fact that we're trusting people to slip me that one answer, and who knows what else they would have slipped me if my dad had not, ducked out. But essentially, it was implied to him that one of the expert panelists might be an expert in Harry Seeley's work, and it would not obviously be the answer to a question, but rather an introduction, right? Oh, this scientist on the expert panel is, a scholar of Harry Seeley's work. Ben, do you know who Harry Seeley is? And I'd have to be able to say yes, or I'd look like an idiot, right? That was the idea. Turns out not at all. It was just the answer to a question. And speaking of emotionally damaging, psychologically very distressing situation to put a very young child in, who, yes, did sign, an NDA and all kinds of agreements as part of participation on the show, that you are not allowed to reveal information about the production of the show, embarrass the producers or so forth. So you put me in this conundrum where I'm not sure, and I know that lawyers are watching me. I'm not sure what I even can say at that point. What I wanted to say when that question came up and I realized what had happened, I wanted to say, hey, they just gave me the answer to this backstage. Something's not right. But ultimately, the stress and the pressure was too much, and I just answered the question. And the game moved forward. That in and of itself, would have been a pretty hard thing for somebody to deal with. The third question they asked, the safety net question that basically determined whether I got any money at all from all these months of studying and taking my time and my family's time to go to Hollywood to do this, ended up not only being a recycled question I had been asked numerous times in the prep rounds, but also with additional poorly researched components. So in the test rounds, they would ask me, what are the 3 carnivorous dinosaurs larger than T-Rex? Which has an answer that most people will agree on, although not all. But the question they asked me was, first of all, name the largest dinosaur ever found, and name the 4 carnivorous dinosaurs larger than T-Rex. And that put me in an immediate crisis situation where I'm like, I can't win here. I can't do this because they're asking me a question with no real answer, right? At the time, the largest dinosaur known was Argentinosaurus. These days, you might say it's Dreadnoughtus, you might say it's Patagotitan. There's a couple of answers people will argue with. And frankly, people probably would argue with Argentinosaurus back in the day as well. Partly because how do you define biggest, right? Biggest can mean heaviest, biggest can mean longest, biggest can mean tallest at the hip, because theropod dinosaurs anyway, the carnivores, as bipeds, whose bodies are oriented parallel to the ground, are tallest at the hip, not at the head, actually. At least usually. They could rear up, probably, but the tallest point you measure is at the hip. these are all valid answers, right? And they all come with significant caveats in that Tyrannosaurus rex is known from a decent number of pretty complete skeletons, right? And all of the candidates for potentially larger animals are known from less than one complete skeleton. Carcharodontosaurus is one of these proposed animals. Spinosaurus is another. And Giganotosaurus is the third. All of these are known from fewer than one complete skeleton. And at the time, in 2009, actually both Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus, their original material, had both been destroyed in World War II. So at the time of this being asked of me, actually two of these animals were known from 0 fossils, right? Just illustrations. They had both been blown up during an Allied bombing raid in 1944. And since then, if you know anything about high-profile controversies in paleontology, new material of Spinosaurus did finally show up. People have been finding their teeth in North Africa for decades, but you can't actually estimate body size based off of teeth. You need more material than that. And starting in, let's see, I think 2014 is when the first new material, the first major new material was being reported. And it turned out that the rear legs of Spinosaurus, according to these new findings, were much shorter than originally thought. So it's actually one of the only known quadrupeds, probably, quadrupedal theropods, 4-legged carnivorous dinosaurs, maybe. Again, the front limbs currently in 2025 are not known either. So we don't actually know a whole lot still about the total potential size of this animal. But it wasn't until 2014 that new major material came out, and it turned out there was a major aspect of its biology, right? It's the length of its back legs we were incorrect about because we didn't have the actual fossils back at that time. And again, if you're making this metric, which is bigger, T-Rex or Spinosaurus, one of your potential measurements could be height at the hip. And in this case, I think it's still pretty inarguable that Tyrannosaurus rex would be taller at the hip than Spinosaurus because we know it's got short little back legs. Maybe if you include the spine above the hips, but we don't actually know a whole lot about how tall the spine would have gone over the hips. That region is not particularly well known. And it wasn't until, I want to say, 2022 that major material from the tail from the same specimen was uncovered, and it turns out it's got a spine on the tail as well. It's got this thick tadpole-looking tail, which is totally different from what was originally envisioned. So there's all kinds of aspects of these animals that was not well understood at the time and is still not completely understood, and there still is not one whole complete known skeleton of Spinosaurus. So to be able to even factually establish a baseline for how long the animal could have been, you know, we generally take this question of which is biggest to be which is longest nose to tail, in which case you run into all kinds of other problems. Carcharodontosaurus was in a similar position where it's not known from terribly good material. The original stuff was lost in World War II. There is new stuff now, but most of the tail isn't known, and the same goes for Giganotosaurus. There is new material of it being excavated right now, if what you hear on social media is correct. But there's still basically huge portions of the skeleton that aren't known. So these body size estimates are done by taking one known element and scaling it up against a close-ish relative of known proportions. Except that all of these animals are fairly unique in their own right. Biology tends to get a little weird when you have an animal cropping out at, you know, more than 42 feet long as a bipedal reptilian predator is a pretty bizarre thing to be. There's a reason we don't see those around anymore. So none of this stuff should be taken as, you know, for example, something you should wager $10,000 on, but that's the exact position I was expected to be in. But that would be the case, that would be the complaint if the question was name the 3 carnivorous dinosaurs largest, but that's not what they asked. They threw in a 4th one and, you know, put me in a position where I can't answer the question properly. Now, I don't have any doubt in my mind that they intended to slip me the name of a 4th before coming on stage, but they weren't able to. And so instead I just had to sit up there and basically argue with the host, Kevin Pollak, to say, I don't think there's a fourth. And I know that they knew that I knew three, the three that people to this day would largely agree on, because I had answered that question repeatedly in test rounds. So I'm like, these are the three, and also here's the largest, so that's 4 of the 5 parts you got right. Again, in a traditional trivia show, they're not asking 5-part questions with 5 answers, typically. Or in the geological periods question, you're getting into, depending on how you split it up, that's 10 plus answers right there. So generally not a smart way to do that, I would say, but I'm not the one writing quote-unquote game shows, and I don't intend to be doing that either. But basically put me in a position where I just can't answer this question, and they've been, to an excessive degree, saying these are the smartest kids. Ben is one of the smartest children in America, and he's a child genius, and he can't answer, the $10,000 question on this show. Which is a humiliating thing to be in, especially because I did and still do disagree with the question that they were answering and with the answer they actually wanted. So I finally get to the point where, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, and I'm like, well, I had just heard this news story that a pubis from a T-Rex was just discovered that's like 12% larger than Sue. Sue at that point was the largest. That's a field museum specimen. At the time was the longest known, the largest Tyrannosaurus Rex specimen, topping out at about 42 feet. Or not 32, 42 feet. And the pubis of this was like 5 to 12% larger than that of Sue, so this is a new record for potentially the largest, but that wouldn't be a new species, right? So I don't have an answer to say. I was tempted to maybe answer Tyrannosaurus batar, which is not generally known by that name. That's Tarbosaurus. So maybe, I was thinking maybe Tarbosaurus is the question they're asking for, but Tarbosaurus is not generally thought of as being larger than Tyrannosaurus Rex. And so now I'm just going through in my mind, like, okay, what are big spinosaurids, right? Maybe a relative of Spinosaurus. And so I just land on Suchomimus, right? It's known from a fairly complete skeleton. I didn't think it was quite in that 42 plus foot long league, and it turned out not to be, right? But the reason why I know that they were not prepared, I don't think they ever intended for me to actually play this game the way that they had pitched it to me, right, as a fair competition. I don't think they had prepared for me to answer anything other than the exact answers they had prepared and were probably ready to slip to me. Because when I said Suchomimus, and that is not an obscure dinosaur, in a competition like this, right, again, if I was the one trying to make this show, and I'm asking a question like this, I would put down, okay, let's write down 50 possible answers that he could come up with, so that if he says something that isn't the right answer, we can still put it up on the board. And when I answered Suchomimus, they paused, and you could almost hear panic happening in the control room. Now, in the show, they have this giant screen that's supposed to be in front of me. And one of the anecdotes that actually did make it into this interview is the fact that at the time, in 5th grade, when I was 10 years old, we didn't know that I actually don't have all that great of vision. I'm not, legally blind or anything. I can basically make my way around without corrective lenses. I wear contacts now. But at the time, I didn't know that. And so I couldn't actually see the board particularly well, in front of me, but I had a smaller electronic display that was close enough that I could actually see. And this just comes down to, again, one of these weird things where if you can do well enough in school, you will not be screened for disabilities for quite a long time, right? I got through a surprising amount, I would say all of my childhood, without ever being able to actually see quote-unquote correctly with 20/20 vision, just because I was always good enough at school that I was never tested for any type of disability. I could answer the questions without apparently being able to see the whiteboard if I was positioned too far away. That's just another anecdote about growing up, as a kid in the U.S., that if you can do well enough, you're just not thought of as being disabled, whereas if you are having trouble in school, that's the first thing they go to is, well, maybe he can't see, maybe he's got a learning disability or something like that. So they never screened me for any of that stuff until about a year after this happened. Anyway, it takes a decent amount of time for them to put the name Suchomimus up on the screen, and when they did, they spelled it wrong. So that tells me that they were absolutely not prepared. They didn't have like a word bank ready. I did more preparation for this show than they did. I'll put it this way. So that comes up, and then, the story goes as it goes. They shut off the lights. They lie that, oh my God, the power went out. We've got to reset. Yeah, right. Just lying to act like we all don't know that I didn't just answer this question incorrectly. And so in the interest of not recapping the entire thing, because you can't just listen to the interview or read the story to get the rest of it, I get sent off to a green room. There's a child psychologist in there. This is one of the minor errors that is in the iHeartRadio interview, is that I was seen by that child psychologist, at least that's who she identified herself as, in between these sets. It wasn't after losing the second round, it was between the rounds. And she says, yeah, he looks sad, and it's like, great, okay, thanks. Like, help me, like, something is not right here. But that's not the role that she was there for. She was just there to verify that, oh my God, sad kid is sad, congratulations. And then in the side room, my dad is asking this producer what was the name they were looking for, and they say Tyrannotitan. Tyrannotitan is still, to this day, not known from particularly complete material. Certainly not enough to confidently scale up to be larger than 42 feet. I don't really talk about this in any of the interviews that I've done, but I do know exactly where they got this idea. I'm pretty sure it's in... it's only ever been reported by a guy named Paul S. Gregory, who, because he was pretty pivotal in understanding certain things about dinosaur biology, he was one of the figures in the so-called dinosaur renaissance in the 70s that sort of revolutionized the conception of dinosaurs from slow, more reptilian in the way that we understand, like iguanas and snakes and turtles, right? Slow, inactive, and he was part of renewing this understanding and bringing it to be large, or not large, but active and warm-blooded. I don't like those terms, warm and cold-blooded, because they don't really make sense. Even endothermic and ectothermic probably don't well represent what's happening biologically within these animals. But warm-blooded basically is what they're talking about. Active, able to maintain an internal temperature, not sluggish and waiting to warm up in the mornings to be able to hunt or whatever. So he was pretty pivotal in that period of time, in the same way that, like, Bob Bacher was, and then a little bit later, or around the same time, Jack Horner. I will take every opportunity I can to point out that Jack Horner is an absolute creep who, as a 69-year-old man and professor or director in a position of authority at the Museum of the Rockies and Montana State, decided to date a 19-year-old student in his lab. Jack Horner is a creep. I really need people to understand this and not parade him around as a hero. Yes, he did some pivotal research on parental care in dinosaurs through Maiasaura, but we don't need to act like he's a hero because of that, right? Anyway, Greg Paul has a pretty prestigious position. He writes the Princeton Field Guides to Dinosaurs, and you might assume that that's a really, because it's Princeton, right? He must be one of these world experts, but Greg Paul actually has a number of really controversial takes in dinosaur taxonomy and stuff like that. He was responsible for this bogus study that came out some years ago. I think this might have been 21 or 22, maybe even 23, that allegedly split Tyrannosaurus rex into 3 independent species, and every other researcher looked at that and was like, no, this is nonsense. So if you read the Princeton Field Guide to Dinosaurs, you will actually, it's not so much the field consensus as much as it is Greg Paul's kind of private, his own understanding, his headcanon, if you will. I hate using that term in context of science, but that is basically what it is. He has a number of theories that basically only he subscribes to, and he loves, as part of making these books, putting body size estimates to animals that you really can't efficiently do that for. You don't have the right material for. So I'm pretty sure that Greg Paul, for one of his books potentially, Tyrannotitan was first published in 2006, so it was not present in any of the study materials that I was looking through. I was reading the second edition of the Dinosauria, which I can look over and see on my shelf right now, which is published in 2004, so it was not present in there. But there's basically nobody I've been able to find, right, as a paleontologist, talking to all kinds of people who work on big predatory dinosaurs, and I ask, do you think Tyrannotitan can be clearly, claimed to be bigger than T-Rex? And nobody but Greg Paul I have ever been able to see say yes to that. So one of the reasons I go to journalists to talk about this story, why I went to a journalist to break this story, is because journalists are responsible for cross-checking, right? I may be the source, and right now I am the only primary source for discussing kind of what happened on this show, but that still means that you should be consulting outside experts and cross-referencing what I say, right? A journalist's responsibility is to not assume everything I say is correct and go and independently check other sources to see what others might think. And in all the years that I've talked about this stuff privately to other paleontologists, you can, for example, ask Steve Brucetti, who is probably one of the top 5 most recognized figures as far as authoritative paleontologists who talk about dinosaurs. When this story came out in 2021, on Twitter, Brucetti was like, anybody who ever tries to tell you that you were wrong about this, no, you were completely correct. Tyrannotitan, you can't say is bigger than T-Rex. So if you have beef with this, take it up with Steve, right? But at any rate, no, they had just been researching this on Wikipedia, I guess, because when we asked what is Tyrannotitan, I genuinely had not heard of it before. They pulled up a Wikipedia page, and someone had just added that it might be bigger than T-Rex, I guess. You can use the edit history to go back to what that page would have looked like in 2009 if you really want to do a deep dive, basically, in what they would have seen during their research. But this was entirely shoddy. This was not an appropriate thing to make the make or break for a 10-year-old trying to make college money, right? And so because I couldn't answer this the way that they wanted to, that blew my first chance. Now I didn't know originally that they were going to give me a second try, which they did. And I don't actually even remember the first 2 questions. This is the point where my memory starts really blacking out, because it was getting to be pretty overwhelming as far as stress goes. A pretty stressful situation. And that's actually like the first thing that these hosts say on this podcast episode right after my interview is done. They're like, this is one of the most stressful episodes we've ever done. It was a pretty stressful situation to be in. I don't remember the first 2 questions they asked me. I'm pretty sure they did ask 2 questions, and that the one I do remember getting wrong was the $10,000 safety net question again. When I was originally drafted for this show, I was only supposed to be answering questions about dinosaurs, and it changed rather last minute to be all of paleontology. Now, dinosaurs were around for about 150 million years. There's a lot to know about them. That's a pretty wide purview. But if you're expecting me to know things about life throughout Earth's history, right, we're starting to get back to 500 plus million years ago till today. Some would say 600 or even 1.8 billion is potentially the oldest evidence of life. So that's a much bigger purview, and I genuinely did not know at that time nearly as much about the Cenozoic, the 66 million years after the dinosaurs, as I did about those 150 million years the dinosaurs were around. So the question they asked me is, can you name the family that Smilodon was from? And I got pretty close. I knew that it's obviously a cat, a felid, and I guessed the name Felis. That's the genus name for domestic cats. The actual answer is Felidae. Or if you want to get really specific, Microstream is the subgroup within felids that they belong to. And actually, when I did this interview, I brought my saber-toothed cat skull, my Smilodon skull. I'm gonna go grab it. Just because I did a fun bit with ASMR with their really nice microphone. So this is my cast replica of a Smilodon skull. And you're not going to be able to see any of this, obviously, because I'm currently streaming under the scope. I can't, like, put the skull under the microscope, but it's a good visual representation because you can actually see the small first upper premolar in the jaw of Smilodon that makes it belong to the family Felidae. This is part of when I actually did get into college and I took a class called mammalogy. We went over all the major families of mammals, including Felidae. So anyway, I'm gonna go put this back on my wall. You should also know that I have a wizard hat sitting on my Smilodon skull. Anyway, I legitimately didn't get that question right. It wasn't within the purview of what I had been studying for up until the last couple weeks. It is what it is. But at that point, you know, I was out of tries, so I was done. I, to be completely clear, left this scenario without winning anything. Right? There was no wage. Because you're not an employee, right? You're a contestant, so you're not compensated for your time. They didn't make me pay for the hotel, fortunately, or the flight from Phoenix to LA and back, of course, but we did not, I didn't win anything, right? I walked away from the experience with worse than nothing, right? With a pretty intense feeling that I had let myself down, that I had let my family down, that I had potentially blown what could have been maybe my only chance to actually, like, pay for college, right? At that point, I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to be able to afford, you know, school tuition. And, you know, eventually, when I actually got to the point of getting into college, I got a pretty good scholarship. I went to an in-state school so I could qualify for in-state tuition. And then my parents ended up having to take out some loans. That totaled to be $22,000-ish, I think $22,800. And I'm not going to say fortunately here, because this isn't a fortunate scenario, but after graduation, a few years after graduation, shortly before, actually, the loan repayment was supposed to come into effect, and this would have been 2022, when I have no ability to start actually making payments on this because nobody was hiring recent college graduates at that time. It's been incredibly hard to make money these days. That's the reason I've been running a Patreon this whole time, is to just try to get something going. Try to cover my costs as best as I can. And, you know, I'm working on it. We're getting there. It's, you know, it is what it is. And again, I'm not going to use the term fortunately because it does involve, you know, a relative of mine passing away, but she left behind enough money for an inheritance for my father, and he decided to use a portion of that to pay off my student debt and my brother's student debt. So again, I'm not going to use the term fortunately here, but I did manage to get through my college education, technically-ish through my scholarship, paying for the majority of it, and then the portion that I wasn't able to cover was able to be taken care of with my parents. Again, my primary privilege in life, I would say, is the fact that I have parents who take care of me, and who have been willing to invest in me in that way. So at the end of the day, you know, $10,000 would not have even paid for half of my student debt, or even close to covering my actual tuition. Now, $500,000 definitely would have, right? Between my brother and I and all the charities that we wanted to give some money to. And we had actually sat down and thought about, okay, if we hit a decent amount of money, which charities do we want to give money to? We had all that discussed ahead of time. This was not going to be, you know, me inheriting a trust or whatever. At the end of the day, you know, I got my degrees. I got through college. I'm not done with college. I don't have a PhD yet, right? You have to go back into a grad program in order to get that. And you don't pay tuition in a graduate program, but you obviously do still have significant costs as far as housing, food, right? If you want to do anything more than sleep, eat, and work, right? You've got all kinds of other expenses, your transportation. Visiting colleges costs money. Conducting research costs money. Sometimes you can get grants to cover that stuff. Sometimes, like in the position where I'm in, I have to do this work independently because there are no institutions backing and supporting me. I'm currently an employee at the University of Arizona, but I have never done any of my work in paleontology through a university or through a museum, right? It has always been independent work. And so even, you know, even till today, it is hard to not sit and think about, like, if they had just given me a real shot at actually genuinely doing what they had offered to me, right? Play a game, answer questions to get college money, and they had actually let me do that instead of interfering and adding all these weird components, all these weird, poorly researched extra aspects that they wanted to feed me the answers to thereafter. If they had just let me play the game, they would have gotten an entertaining episode out of it, I'm sure. I don't doubt that I could have done at least decently. In all the test rounds, I managed to get probably about 70% of those questions right. So maybe I wouldn't have hit the $500,000, but I still could have done pretty well for myself, and that would have taken a lot of pressure off as far as being worried about even just getting into college, getting through college, and then having to pay back, you know, all the money that had been taken out to get me through there, right? I could have just focused on being a student and attending conferences. And, oh, by the way, applying to college costs money. Applying to conferences costs money. You know, running the research circuit is not cheap. And you're generally not paid to do it, except through, like, an academic appointment. And those are incredibly, incredibly competitive, especially in a small niche field like vertebrate paleontology. But one of the things that, and I'm going to wrap up here fairly soon, because I've gone on for a little over an hour now, and I'm still not finding any shark teeth in this stuff as I expected, so I'm probably going to move on from this bag next week to a different bag of material that may or may not have stuff in it. One of the things that got kind of cut off in this interview, so I start off an anecdote by saying this is one of the more darkly humorous aspects of this, and then I describe basically coming home after, not coming home, but getting back to the hotel after, in what felt to me at the time like blowing this huge opportunity that I got, and potentially blowing my chance to make it into science at all, right? And just the emotional devastation and the transformation that happens in the immediate aftermath of that, of realizing, like, this is what the real world is like. I have to be stronger, I have to be smarter, I have to be a little bit less naive, right, about how the real world works. And so that point, they kind of cut it off, that quote, at that point. Around the time that I basically say, you know, the child, if I even was a child at that point, I was doing things at that age, right? I had already gone on my first excavation. I was volunteering in a museum. I was already doing things that didn't if I was a child at that time, going into that show, I definitely was not coming out of it. And so the quote that I give basically cuts off there where I say the child that perished, right? He was not strong enough to deal with the devastation and the heartbreak that came out of having this opportunity and blowing it. It kind of cuts off there. So it almost sounds like I'm saying that that's hilarious, but that's not actually the end of the anecdote. So the full anecdote is that when I emerged from that hotel room, and that hotel, by the way, I'm going to look it up real quick so I get its name right. Is it the Hilton? Doubletree. Los Angeles Fancy Hotels. It was a pretty nice place they put me. Okay, not that fancy. It was not a Ritz-Carlton. It was close enough to... Oh, screw it. Whatever. Whichever hotel it was. So I emerged from that hotel room, and I'm basically like, look, this is Saturday, and our plane ride home is like Sunday early afternoon or something like that. So I'm like, look, we're still here in LA. The tar pits are here. I'd like to go see the tar pits. So that was immediately in the aftermath of this, me deciding what I need to do instead of like quitting or... I mean, that's basically, right, that's the options you're faced with, is just say, all right, I had this opportunity, they hyped me up as a genius, and I totally blew it. I'm clearly not... I mean, and to be clear, and this was a thing that I said that did not make it into the interview, I don't think... Not only am I not a genius, I don't think genius is a thing. I don't think anybody's a genius. You can send me any example of somebody that you think is a genius, and I think it can be argued that you're wrong, right? There's one individual in particular that people use that word for these days, and I think it's pretty obvious now that he's not a genius. And even, historical scientific figures who were obviously very intelligent, very apt, are typically not solely responsible for all of these fantastic discoveries, right? Everybody doing science is standing on the shoulders of giants and is only able to do what they do because of the privileges they have in their life, and because they have access to prior knowledge, and you have to be pretty intelligent. But genius, this idea that you can just be born as one of these abnormally intelligent people, is... I don't think that's a real thing, right? But it's obviously humiliating to have somebody talk about you that way and then completely fail at what you were allegedly, a savant at doing. And while it took a long time, and generally in the interviews that I've done about this, they tend to not... I'm pretty open about the fact that I had some intense mental health struggles because of this going on for quite a while. When I got to college, I was seeing a counselor, I was in therapy for several years, and that's not something to be ashamed of, right? When you experience something in life that overwhelms your ability to cope, that is the definition of trauma. And you are not able to recover from trauma on your own. Sometimes you need a mental health professional who's able to help recontextualize and help give you tools to go through these things on your own. And that's what I needed, and that's what I did. And before ever going to the Arizona Republic, I talked to my therapist. It's actually the last thing I did before doing my first interview with John Diana, was literally I came right from a therapy appointment on campus, where we talked about, is this something that could actually potentially help me, or is this maybe a maladaptive decision? And ultimately, what we talked about was that feeling like I didn't have to remember in clear detail every single thing that had happened in this incident, because I was one of the only witnesses and the only person who experienced my side of the story, right? So I had a lot of anxiety about, if someone ever questions me about this, I need to be able to answer exactly what happened. and therefore keep this memory as crystal clear in my mind as possible, then that doesn't allow you to move on. So at some point, I'm not going to agree to do interviews about this because I'm going to let myself forget as much as I can what actually happened, you know? Where am I going with this? So generally, these interviews have been pretty... I'm sure they see it as, okay, we don't need to talk too much about what I had disclosed to them about my issues and my struggles stemming from that time with low self-esteem and an intense self-loathing, definitely in those immediately following years, not just for losing, but also being tricked into what I saw as cheating. Now, I need to be very clear that one cannot cheat a rigged game. They never intended for me to actually complete this thing the way that they had sold it to me. You can't cheat a rigged game, and it was not a fair position to put a child in anyway. Again, blame capitalism, and then blame non-union reality TV before ever blaming anyone in my family for putting me in this position, or blaming me for choosing to take this opportunity, which I took at face value. But I basically had that choice of either saying, I want to double down, or I want to do something else, right? This is too much. And coming out of that hotel room as a different person, being a little more aware now about, okay, if it sounds too good to be true, it is. If it feels like a trap, you're already in one, as the bard would say. This was never a fair fight. This was not what they told me it would be. And I just need to, but in the immediate aftermath, my thought was, I just need to get better. I just need to learn more. It was my fault for not knowing enough. These weren't fair questions, but if I had at least heard of Tyrannotitan before today, maybe I could have gotten that question right, and things could be different. So I just need to, keep up the work. And so I asked my parents, can we go see the La Brea Tar Pits? So the darkly humorous aspect that I was alluding to that didn't actually make it into this interview is that we went to the La Brea Tar Pits, which features dozens of Smilodon, and makes it very clear what family they belong to, right? It's typed out, right, on the plaques there. So if I had gone to the La Brea Tar Pits before taping the show as opposed to after, I probably would have gotten that question right, because the answer was literally posted up everywhere. So that was a lot going on in my mind, being on a sound stage, in a studio, in a backlot in LA, in Hollywood, in the morning, and then in the afternoon staring at a plaque with a Smilodon, right, quote unquote, the saber-toothed tiger, but they're not tigers, not even close. Staring down one of these animals in actuality with the answer to the question that I had needed in order to win $10,000 right in front of me, right? At the time, that was a lot to process, but looking back at it, that's kind of hilarious, right? And the one other thing that I tend to mention that hasn't made it so far into any of these recollections, any of these publications, is that actually the same hotel that I was in, which I just failed to find the name of, the same hotel that I had stayed in during the taping of the show was the same hotel that in 2013, so 4 years later, I was staying in while attending the annual meeting of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. Just 4 years later, right, I had immediately made the choice, I just need to study more, I need to try harder, I wasn't good enough, it was my fault. And as, I was still being helped along by a lot of mentors and also my father helping me continue on this path, even though I now had obviously a lot of weight on my shoulders, and feeling like I had a lot left to prove. I managed to attend this professional conference at that point, and that would have been probably October of 2013, late October, early November 2013. So I would have been 14 years old at this professional conference. And it was in the exact same hotel. So in some ways, you know, that really reinforced to me that, like, the reason why I didn't run away from paleontology because of this is that the show was not actually about paleontology, right? This is about poorly researched trivia that, in antithesis to science, assumed clear, concise, and singular answers towards complex questions, which is not how science works in reality, right? And my memories of being at SVP in 2013, and there were some really cool, actually really famous talks that went down at that conference. That was when the first skeletal material beyond the arms of an animal called Deinocheirus. If you know your dinosaurs, you know Deinocheirus from the 70s up until 2014 when that paper was finally published, was only known from its arms, and nobody knew what the rest of the body looked like. And just as with Spinosaurus, the actual body of the animal looked incredibly different from what people thought it was. And it was really cool being one of the first people in the world sitting in on that talk in that room to see what Deinocheirus actually looked like. It was amazing. So, you know, that's not necessarily humor, but that is one of those interesting happenstances in life, right? That this very same hotel I was in 2009 was also the place where this conference, which played a big part in me, you know, actually learning more about what real paleontology is, which is presenting in a group of peers, right, evidence and making arguments in favor of what you think answers to big questions might be, but not wagering money over it, and certainly not making it little children's problems to get singular answers correct, or really 5-part answers, 12-part answers correct in order to get into college, right? That's sick and psychotic. Again, the villain of this story is capitalism. The villain of this story is a production company which specifically chose a business strategy to not have to work with unions, and unions with safety protections in mind. We should, and we should always be demanding this, even if this seems like a very far away goal now, much further away than it used to be even, of having tuition-free public colleges and universities. That's the only way you stop little kids from feeling like they have to do this kind of thing, being put in this vulnerable position to pay for college tuition. If getting into college is only based off of merit and not based off of how much money you or your parents have, no one would be in this position, right? I probably have one of the weirdest and more unique stories in how that kind of pressure affects young kids, but there are a lot of people who have probably had to do all kinds of things in order to get into college and pay for it, right? We should just have this because science and knowledge and information is part of your heritage as being a human being, right? Knowledge should not be kept behind certainly tens of thousands of dollars in tuition, right? It should be as free as possible. And so I hope you'll understand that although I do obviously have this Patreon where stuff is paywalled a lot of the time, I try to make as much as what I make free, at least if not initially, then eventually, right? I have this virtual museum that I built that is totally free. I make a bunch of the web pages, these articles that I write free. I film these videos when I'm out in the field that are, you know, just shown to patrons initially, but eventually are free on YouTube, at least some of them. I'm thinking more so now that I want to keep my other field sites kind of more confidential and might just only be showing the Menifee expedition from now on. I still haven't decided, but that's probably where I'm going to go. I don't know. But I hope you'll appreciate that, like, I'm still, as a human being, trying to make my way in science, still having to pay all kinds of costs as far as, you know, submitting papers and college applications, and also, you know, all this other stuff that every single person has to deal with, right? Anything you do to tackle the cost of living crisis, anything you do to bring real protections and collective bargaining, into the workplace, these things help everybody, and they help scientists too, right? We are workers in this system. And so all these different things that we talk about that improve the lives of workers help out people like me too. But anyway, I hope there's appreciation for the fact that, like, I try to make stuff as free as possible, even though I still do need to be surviving in some way. So I'm trying to do the best that I can to kind of straddle that line, support myself, but also make sure that somebody who isn't able to pay still has access to what I see as being, even though it's my writing, my photography, my video game, I still see it because I'm building off of all kinds of knowledge that is only available to me because other people went through all these steps in science to make it accessible, right? That I need to be respecting and be a part of that tradition too. So that's just kind of the addendum that I want to add to that interview. If you want to email me about it, I think I have my email listed on YouTube. ptpaleo@proton.me is the email that you should go to for basically any business inquiries, or if you just want to reach me, that's the way to do it. You can leave a comment on this video, whatever, or don't. It's a free, I was going to say it's a free country. Well, maybe it never was. Who knows? But that's going to go ahead and do it for this stream, so I'm going to go ahead and close that off. Again, we've been looking at sediment from 78.5 million years ago under the microscope because I am a paleontologist, and long story short, I survived. I made it through a lot of stuff that shouldn't have been on my shoulders. And I still do this because this is truly the thing that I always wanted to do. And I'm still here. So if it gives any reason to reflect or helps steel you in helping you get through something that you're getting through in your life, knowing that, for example, right, just this one random person who does streams on the internet every now and again went through what I would consider a pretty intense thing in my childhood, and I got through it. I think that gives proof that human beings are very, very capable, and you're stronger than you think you are. I didn't think I would ever have the strength to actually talk about this stuff, or even casually be talking about it on a YouTube stream, right? So give yourself some credit. You're stronger than you think you are. And capitalism is the enemy. Have a good day. I'll see you next week.